We begin today's colloquium. It is a great pleasure that I welcome on behalf of the SNJ University, Shri Biju Viraj Patnaik, who is the Principal Advisor to the Commissioners of the Supreme Court. He works closely with the Commissioners in discharging the mandate, that is communicating issues and concerns relevant to food entitlements and articulating policy demands with the concerned authorities to augment the implementation of the orders relevant to the right to food, and is also active in the right to health care. He makes state visits, he conducts inquiries and verifies complaints with regard to compliance of the Supreme Court orders. Viraj Patnaik also works very closely with the state advisors to oversee the performance of the food schemes on the ground. He also serves as the overall in charge of the day-to-day manning of the Commissioner's Secretariat. In addition, he also assists the Central Vigilance Committee of the Public Distribution System. He has been appointed by the Indian Supreme Court in an honorary capacity. Viraj Patnaik has been a member of several committees in the Planning Commission, in the Government of India, and in the state government on matters related to food, healthcare, human rights issues, and public sector reforms. So we're indeed extremely fortunate that Mr. Patnaik has accepted an invitation to be here with all of us and share his views. And today he will be talking, as you have seen in the announcement, about why is it that the children today in India are getting a raw deal with regard to malnutrition control and healthcare, despite having a plethora of state-run programs in the area of health and nutrition for many decades now. And the main programs, as we already know, are ICDS and the school feeding program, also known as the midday meal program, or the nutrition support for primary education. So, Mr. Patnaik will dwell on these issues and share his valuable experiences with us, following which we will have a discussion and questions from the students. So, welcome once again, Viraj. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shubha. Thank you all of you for coming here. I know it's one of the really painful tasks of going to universities to attend lectures immediately after and have a speaker who's going to show you a PowerPoint presentation with lots of figures and numbers. And PowerPoints have an ability to become both powerless and pointless, especially after a lunchtime session. So I just use these to illustrate. It won't take too much of your time and probably speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we can go into discussions. Friends, I work on the right to food essentially, and I've been associated with the Right to Food campaign as well as the Supreme Court case, which I'm sure you've heard about because Harsh was here and spoke to all of you. Now, I'm going to situate this, the Shubha asked us to focus more on children's issues and particularly child malnutrition, and look at some of these social determinants. Why is it that we are where we are with regard to child nutrition, and where we are is very unflattering in the community of nations. And India's economic growth which is phenomenal, has been great. In the last plan period, we grew by 8%. But for the recession, we were predicting a growth rate of 8.6% in the current plan period. So it was something that the India growth story is unfolded over the last 20 years. And that's what the world knows about. But the larger picture, or one of the major issues that confront us is that despite this growth, we're not creating jobs. And all the evidence now shows that it's a jobless growth. And worse, what is happening is we are consistently going down in our social sector ranking. If you take up any report globally, on any indicator, pick any indicator of your choice. In literacy, education, healthcare, malnutrition, any indicator. And we are pretty much at the bottom. And what's worse is that countries which have a lower per capita income than India does, and which have had a much lower rate of growth than India does, have been doing much better. Bangladesh, for instance, is a case in point. We'll come to that in a bit. And overall, if you look at it, despite all this India shining story, India remains a very poor country. We are a very poor country. I have no doubt about that. Forget where you were studying, forget these campuses, forget the IT city, forget Bangalore. If you look at India, we are one of the poorest countries in terms of resources and per capita distribution of resources. If you leave Africa aside, as Jean Reyes and Amartya Sen keep reminding us, outside of Africa, there are only 16 countries in the world which have a lower gross per capita national income than India does. A lower gross national per capita income than India. Just 16 countries. So we are a very poor country. But what's worse, what makes it worse is our social indicators. I mean, if you take, for instance, youth female literacy rate, how many young women are, what's the literacy rate amongst youth, women youth? There are only 5 countries, Afghanistan, Bhutan, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea and Yemen, which have a lower youth literacy, female literacy rate than India does, outside of Africa. There are only 4 countries in the world outside of Africa which have a higher infant mortality rate than India. And the countries are Afghanistan, Cambodia, Haiti and Pakistan. Other than these 4 countries, if you leave Africa aside, other than these 4 countries, every other country in the world has a lower infant mortality rate than India does. So we come from a very unflattering position, and that's why the work of the Right to Food campaign, the Indian Supreme Court, activists, academics, nutritionists, all of you is very, very critical, because we are heading towards a situation where, with growing inequity, we are increasingly reaching a point where it's becoming a threat to the very nature of our democracy. You can't have a situation where the second fastest growing economy in the world has close to 50% of its children malnourished, 46% child malnourishment rate. If you adjust it by WHO board standards, about 42.6, 43%. So what this effectively means that in this second fastest growing economy in the world, the hardest lesson that most mothers, parents have to teach their children is the lesson of how to live with hunger. And that's, as you can imagine, I don't know how many of you have really experienced hunger, but as you can imagine, for any parent, the lesson to teach your children of how to survive hunger or how to live with hunger is the hardest lesson of all. Now, if you look at what makes the situation particularly alarming is the fact that we're not making progress. And if you look at the data here, children who are stunted, children who are wasted, and children who are underweight, malnourished. And you take 1993, 1999, 2005, 2006, and you look at the progress we made. On stunting, we went down from 45.5 to 38.4%. 38.4% means 40% of Indian kids are stunted. Wasting, almost 20% of children are wasted, and 46% of our children are malnourished. But between 1998, 99 and 2005-06, you will notice that we registered a 1% decline, just a 1% decline in our malnourishment rates, at a time when we were growing at 8%. And what's even more shocking is we don't have data after 2005-06. We don't have national data after 2005-06. So here is it. Everybody acknowledges the Prime Minister, our very beloved Prime Minister, called it a national shame. He called it a curse. Every policy maker, every government minister acknowledges that we have a severe problem. And yet it's a problem that we don't even want to measure. It's been 7 years since the National Family Health Survey was done. It's already overdue by 2 years. And we are not in a position today to even say with certainty that this survey is going to take place or not. Compare it to any other field. Now, you look at manufacturing data, you look at GDP growth data, you look at employment data, you look at any other data set that this country considers important. You have quarterly data available with us. You have monthly data available. In some cases, if it's a stock market, you have minute-to-minute data available. And the entire country is obsessed about it. But how many people really care? How many talk shows on television have you heard which are raving and ranting as to if you can have stock market updates and the country going into a dizzy with every 1,000 drop in the census? The fact that for the last 7 years we don't have malnutrition data, that's the magnitude of the challenge that we are facing. I'll skip this. Now, much of the problem in malnutrition is under the age of 3. And that's something that institutionally, globally, one is recognizing now. The importance of the first 1,000 days, as Mr. Amir Khan is going to tell you over the next few days, part of his campaign against malnutrition, if he hasn't already said so. The first 1,000 days in a child's life are the most critical. And the damage that's done in the first 1,000 days then gets very difficult to reverse in the next 2 years. And when we talk about child malnutrition, we're generally talking about the data below the age of 5. Now, if you look at our Now, Indian kids start off with a disadvantage, and that's because they're born underweight. And there are a number of factors that we'll go into why we have children below the weight of 2.5 kilos at birth. A normal baby weighs about 2.5 kilos. Why is it that children in India, 30% of our children in India are below 2.5, close to 30% are below 2.5 kilos? So you start off at a disadvantage. And then, and that disadvantage, if you compare to Africa, for all of Africa, the average is about 16%. Only 16% of African babies are born below the weight of, or less than 2.5 kilos at birth, as compared to close to 30% in India, almost double. Our child malnutrition rate, our stunting rates are almost double that of sub-Saharan Africa, which is, you all know, are a set of countries which are associated with poverty, hunger, famine, war, and so on, and do not have stable governments, most of them. So that's a starting point. And then it starts declining. And by the age of 2, the damage is done. Now, if a child remains, stunting is permanent. Heights, once you lose height, once you get stunted, it's for life. You cannot reverse that. It's irreversible. Now, if you have a situation where 45% of your children are stunted, that's one thing. You physically, you do not develop your full potential. But even more worryingly, by the age of 5, your cognitive development, in a sense, all the wiring in the brain happens by the age of 5. That's irreversible. If you do not get enough psychological stimulation, if you do not get the right amount of food and nutrition, the development of the brain is irreversibly changed. That person, that girl, that boy will never develop fully as to the full potential that he or she could have as a human being. And so imagine now a situation where 46% of our children are malnourished. What that means is nearly half of this country's future is not going to achieve its full potential. And that's why I think we should all be worried. I am, and you certainly should be. Now this is the comparison that you have. India, Brazil, China, and Russia. If you take low birth weight, 28% in India, 8% in Brazil, 2% in China, 6% in Russia. If you take any other indicator, under 5 malnutrition, Brazil 4%, India 43%, China 6%. If you compare it to our neighborhood, countries which we don't accept maternal mortality, except 1 or 2 indicators, India is actually doing worse than even countries in our neighborhood. Bhutan, Sri Lanka, of course, Sri Lanka has the best. Bhutan and Sri Lanka have the best indicators. But Bangladesh, classic case of a country which started off in the 90s, behind India in every single social indicator. But by the end of the 90s, by the time we had transformed, we became the second fastest growing economy, we started buying over European companies, we changed our entire development philosophy from self-reliance to reliance. In that period, Bangladesh, where pretty much nothing happened in terms of the kind of phenomenal growth that you saw in India, managed to overtake us on every single social indicator. And that's the situation with regard to India and the world. And if you look at this table, which looks at the percentage underweight, series of countries. Now just look at the countries, start from the bottom. Dominican Republic, Swaziland, Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Kenya, Malawi, Guinea, Nigeria, Mali, all of them doing better insofar as malnourishment, the percentage of underweight children is concerned. So we are pretty much right at the bottom. If you look at the Global Hunger Index, which takes just 3 indicators and ranks 88 countries, creating a composite index out of 3 indicators. That's child undernutrition, child mortality, and percentage of the population that consumes less than 1800 calories. Just 3 simple indicators. And we are ranked 65 out of 88 countries. We are ranking 88 countries, the worst of, we are right there at the bottom. And if you take individual states, if you take Madhya Pradesh, and if you treat Madhya Pradesh as a country, Madhya Pradesh is doing the second worst because almost 60% of children in Madhya Pradesh are malnourished as per NFHS3. I believe the situation should have improved. I hope that with all the effort that's been put in by so many players in many states, including Madhya Pradesh and Orissa, Gujarat, Rajasthan, that the situation would have changed in 6 years. But as I said, we don't know. We still don't know. If you look at where they are geographically located, where is it, which parts of the country that our children, the highest concentration of malnutrition, and you'll see that if you superimpose this map with the NSSO map on poverty, the only surprise is Gujarat, which actually slipped back.
between NFHS 2 and NFHS 3, Gujarat actually registered a higher rate of malnutrition than other countries. There were a few than other states. There were a few states like Gujarat which did badly, but otherwise it's the usual suspects. Orissa, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Bihar, UP, MP, and so on. And then in the range 35 to 39%, it's pretty much the rest of the country. The only exceptions being Kerala and Tamil Nadu and parts of the northeastern India. And we really have to ask what is happening, what have they done right? At least the states which have done better than other states in India, what is it that they have done right? What are the lessons that we can learn from them as we move on? But even before we go to that, if you look at the determinants of malnutrition, now all of us, including many activists, NGOs, campaigners, associate malnutrition largely with hunger. And it's a very obvious thing that if you don't get enough food, you'll be malnourished. If you overeat, you'll be obese. Seems like a very simple thing. But malnutrition is actually much more than just about hunger. Hunger is a very critical determinant of malnutrition, or the lack of access to food or not having the right to food is very, very critical determinant in malnutrition. But it is not the only determinant. The relationship between food and malnutrition is the relationship, say, between textbooks and education. Textbooks are a necessary but not a sufficient condition for achieving education. It's the same thing. And malnutrition is a link of very complicated factors, including inadequate dietary intake, diseases, of course, inadequate access to food, which is linked to resources, linked to income, diet diversity, quality of food, and so on. There is a direct relationship between inadequate care for mothers and children and discrimination against women. Of course, in this discrimination against women, and discrimination of any sort actually, whether it's Dalits, whether it's this, India has a competitive edge over the rest of the world. We are number one in this. Forget where we are, maybe at the bottom of the indicators or most things. But insofar as discrimination is concerned, no one can beat us. We have the oldest institutionalized system of discrimination in the form of caste. We invent newer and newer forms of discrimination against women every day, and we're pretty much right there at the bottom. And that's another huge determinant. And lastly, access to primary health care, drinking water, sanitation, availability of health services. And as I go along, you'll see where we are on those parameters as well. This is just to show the age at which the damage is done, for stunting, underweight, and wasting. But we skip it. Now, if you look at, since we're looking at the broader determinants, now we don't associate, say, a mother's education with malnutrition, but if you look at the data, if a mother has had no education, and this is all government data, by the way, every single data set I'm using is government data. This is not a private survey, this is not NGO data, this is what the government admits as its own data. So if you look at, if a mother has no education, the chances that the child would be malnourished would be stunted as 57%, and 52% that the child would be underweight, as compared to 22% if she's had 12 years or more of education, and 18% in case of underweight, which is also incredibly high. In other countries where health and sanitation are sorted out, this correlation works much better. It works much better. If you have good access to primary health care, if you have sanitation, access to private toilets, and if you have clean sources of drinking water, mother's education becomes a very key determinant. By household wealth, this is something that we all know, and intuitively we should understand that if you are poor, then the chances of your having access to all these determinants is much lower. So if you're poor in India, the chances that you're stunted is 60%. People from well-off families are taller. People who have access to better nutrition are taller. They're not just obese, as that's a new epidemic, but I'm not talking about that we're going to face in the coming years, but you also grow taller. And there's data sets across countries to show, if you take the post-World War period and you look at countries like, say, Japan, and you can actually see that the entire population has put on more inches in terms of height. So we know that that's a direct correlation. Then you have underweight. Your chances of being underweight is much higher if you're poor, and your chances of being wasted, of course, is dramatically more, almost double. But even in this, what is worrying, on this and anemia amongst women, what is worrying is that even amongst the richest quintile of Indians, we're not able to crack the problem. If you look at anemia, for instance, almost 70% of our, almost 60% of women have mild to moderate anemia. And if you were, but all of them are not from, they're distributed across income quartiles. So even if you're from a well-off family and if you're a woman, the chances that you're anemic are much higher than if you were in another part of the world. And that should again worry us. By caste and tribe, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, other no surprises here. Chances of being stunted, wasted and underweight, if you belong to a disadvantaged group, a marginalized group, a discriminated against group, much higher. Households with taps and sources of drinking water, let's look at the correlation. If you have an improved water source, then you have a better chance of not contracting infections, and therefore you have a better chance again of survival, of not being either stunted, wasted or underweight. But in India, this correlation does not come through very well, simply because there is another aspect to water, and that is sanitation. You may have access to a private source of water, but if you do not have sanitation, you do that. And that's where really a huge bit of the problem is, because 52% of all open defecations that happen anywhere in the world on any given day happen in India. 52%. We're the country with the highest amount of open defecation in the world. And that now is proving to be is now being understood increasingly as being a very, very, very key determinant for malnutrition, for stunting, for wasting, for being underweight. And if you look at households with improved sanitation, we're not making progress at all. Total sanitation campaign was went down the drain. If you look at the percentage increases between 2002 and 2008-9, we don't see a dramatic improvement in sanitation. In fact, if you look at people, percentage of population defecating out in the open, which is a study done by UNICEF and Taru in 2008, so it's more current, and I've only used it because it's more current. Although the data is not very different from the older official data sets that you have in sanitation, the figures speak for themselves. And even in better off states, we have a problem, but the problem is less acute. Tamil Nadu does much better than, say, UP or Bengal or Chhattisgarh or Maharashtra. Now, if you look at what is the correlation between stunting, wasting and underweight, by source of sanitation, that if you had increased sanitation, improved sanitation, do you have a better chance of not being malnourished? And that again clearly shows that in houses which had access to improved sanitation, 34% of children were stunted, but that increased to 53% as soon as you went low defecation. Similarly for wasting and for being underweight. Then there is a whole lot of nuancing on this that you can do. This is what I was talking about in terms of low birth weight. So if you follow children who are born with a low birth weight and children who are born normal, and you find that in terms of stunting, if you were born with a low birth weight, the chances that you will become stunted, wasted or remain underweight is much, much higher. For instance, if you had a normal weight at birth at the age of 5, only a third of these children were underweight, whereas it was as high as 46% in terms of being underweight if for children who were less than 2.5 kilos at birth. Mother's nutritional status, again a very, very key determinant, as you can see here. Healthy mothers are healthy babies. World Magazine, borne out by data, particularly in India. And that's where when we spoke about mother's education and when I spoke about discrimination against women being key to the battle against malnutrition, this is precisely why I was saying that, because look at the very direct correlation between mothers being underweight and children being underweight. So friends, this is broadly where we are in terms of the situation. Now, what is it that we've been doing for 60 years? That's the first question that comes to his mind, that if the situation has been so grave, what is it really that we've been doing as a country over the last 60 years? And why has it not worked? Why are we still looking at figures like this in 2013? We should have sorted this out. If Brazil can do it, if China can do it, if Russia can do it, if Bangladesh can do it, then certainly we should have been able to solve this out earlier. So what are the institutional mechanisms? What is the government been doing all these years? And why is it not really worked in case of child malnutrition? Now the only institutional mechanism that the government has, if you look at the larger social determinants, of course because there are so many, there are a number of schemes. We monitor 9 schemes with the government of India on behalf of the Supreme Court. But there must be dozens and dozens of schemes which cover water, sanitation, healthcare and so on. We don't have time to talk about all of that. I'm just going to focus on 1 or 2 programs and try and take you through as to why is it that in these programs we've really not done as well as we could have done in this period. Now, the only institutional mechanism for children under the age of 6 is the ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Services. I'm sure all of you heard about it. You all heard about Anganwadi centers. So, very simple concept. It was started about 75 years ago. It was started in 1975, more than 30 years back. And when it was started, it was a very cutting-edge program globally in terms of its design. Simply because it had within itself an integrated package of 6 services. You had maternal health, you had child health, you had preschool education, you had supplementary nutrition, and you had a bit of a focus on adolescents, not that much. So at that point in time, because you were delivering 6 essential services under one roof in the form of an Anganwadi center, and you were creating the institutional infrastructure to deal with this issue, there was a lot of hope that this program would work. But when all studies with the ICDS over the last few years have shown that it's not really worked. I wouldn't say it's not really worked. It's not really worked in areas in most parts of the country. It's worked in Tamil Nadu, it's worked in Himachal, it's worked in a few states, where states and external agencies supporting the state have put in that additional effort to make it work. Otherwise, by and large, the country hadn't worked for a very long time. And the reasons for that were very simple. Some of them had to do with the institutional design of the program, and some of them had to do with implementation of the program. Now, when we talk about state schemes, often our focus is on the implementation issue because it hits us hard. I went to an Anganwadi center and I did not find the Anganwadi worker there. That's so therefore the program is done. But sometimes more important than how a program is being implemented is how is the program being designed, and the question to ask is that if this program was getting implemented 100% the way it is being designed, will it lead to the desired outcome or not? And I'm afraid in case of the ICDS, there were some fundamental design flaws, which we now recognize and we're trying to now address. The government of India is trying to address through the restructured ICDS and so on. So what were these flaws? And some flaws which we're not addressing, and I'll talk about those. One of the biggest flaws of the ICDS was the fact that it was not, the entire focus of the program was for children above the age of 3. And as we now know, and we've known for quite a bit, quite many years now, the real problem is in the first 1,000 days. And our ICDS program is designed and structured in a way where the first 1,000 days cannot be taken care of. First, it's open for a very short period during the day. You have just one worker. And that one worker is expected to take care of theoretically at least 40 children. Okay, because if you say there are 40 children and there's no Anganwadi, government will set up an Anganwadi, so presumably that one worker takes care of 40 children. And there's a helper who's supposed to help cook the supplementary nutrition plus do additional work. But because of the workload, the only thing effectively that happens in an ICDS center is this feeding program. And this feeding program is the preparation of a hot cooked meal as mandated by the Supreme Court orders now, which is served to the children. But children, particularly smaller children, have very small tummies, and if they have to eat X number of calories, we can eat them at one go because we have larger tummies. But children have very small tummies, so they need to be fed 5-6 times during the day. And the food that they need to be fed needs to be more calorie dense. It needs to be, because you have to absorb more calories in smaller quantities. It needs to be more calorie dense. That the ICDS in its current shape cannot deliver that, just because of the staffing issue. And the solution to that is very simple, which is to increase the work. And the second problem, of course, is that because it's a short time program, it's not open for the full day, mothers who have very young babies cannot leave their babies at the ICDS center and go to work. They have to carry their children to the workplace. And that's a very serious concern because if mothers are carrying the babies to the workplace, they're not just exposed to the health and occupational hazards that the mother faces, but also mother cannot take the time off to feed her baby or care for her baby. The baby is put in a corner, often by taken care of with sibling care. A slightly older child in the family takes care of the baby while the mother is working. And the solution to this was very simple, which is to convert every ICDS center also into a creche and have an Anganwadi come creche, appoint a second worker, create more space, provide clean drinking water, provide sanitation facilities at the ICDS center so that you can take care of children below the age of 2 years. And that is something that did not happen. The second major flaw in the program is that child malnutrition has been seen exclusively as being the burden of the Integrated Child Development Services. And the reason for that is very simple, is because there has been no institutional understanding in government so far of the social determinants that lead to child malnutrition. There is very little institutionalized understanding. And when I say institutionalized understanding, I don't mean to say that the Chief Secretary of Karnataka doesn't know this or the Secretary to Government of India for Health doesn't know this. They know it. But the system, the health system, from the Anganwadi worker right up to the supervisor or the CDPO or the director, the structure or the health structure, they don't see or they do not make that linkage that they need to make in their minds about malnutrition being a problem that is multidimensional, which needs many approaches. Therefore, the health system works in its own silo, the ICD system works in its own silo. Neither of the departments is keen to own the problem of malnutrition because they believe that if they own the problem of malnutrition, if they say that this is our problem, then they would be held responsible for this mess. So it's a passing the buck game between the health ministry and the ICDS ministry for most part of the last few decades. It's not to say that things are not changing now, they are. But that is the second big flaw. That there was no convergence between health services and the Integrated Child Development Services. No convergence between sanitation and ICDS. No convergence between drinking water supply and ICDS. It's no convergence between education or other programs and ICDS. So it's a program that was seen in isolation. The third problem was of outreach. That is one problem that we have more or less, I would say, resolved now. We had about 600,000 ICDS centers in 2001. Today we have well over 1.5 million. And much of it is, if you just browse the web, is because the Supreme Court orders, because in 2001, as part of the petition put by People's Union for Civil Liberties in a case which is known as the Right to Food case, which I'm sure Harsh Mandar would have spoken to you about when he came here last. Essentially because of that case, there was a tremendous pressure on government to increase outreach. So outreach has gone up. So you have more Anganwadi centers now, but by no means does it mean that quality is gone up. It's not that the outreach of quality services has gone up, but certainly the physical presence of the department has gone up, and that's something that is visible on the ground today. Even in the most remote parts of the country, tribal hamlets and SC hamlets, willingly you go there, you do find a ICDS center, and more often than not, a functional ICDS center. So that's the second flaw. The third issue that I wanted to speak about. One of the major problems in implementation is that this is a program that has always been under-resourced. We had this well-designed program for its time. For its time, the ICDS in the 70s was a very well-designed program. But we did not expand it. We never universalized it because we never recognized that we have a problem on malnutrition. It's only recently that, this has become a societal issue. I hope it has. I believe it has. Because if Amit Khan is talking about it, there must be something to it that gets him talking about it. So hopefully, if it hasn't, in those parts of the country where the message hasn't reached, it will. Now, because this program, because malnutrition was not understood as something being as something that we should be concerned about, you had a situation where investments were not made to deal with the problem. So the ICDS was an under-resourced program. That has changed in the last 5 years. It's still under-resourced. It's still very under-resourced. But if you look at between, say, the 10th plan and the 11th plan, and if you look at between the 11th plan and the 12th plan, you see a 5-fold increase in funding for ICDS, which has come about because of a lot of public pressure, a because of a lot of pressure from the courts, and because of a genuine acknowledgement that we need to do something about it. Is this money enough? It's not. Is it just because the plan allocates the money, is that the money that is given to government? It's not. I mean, take the current year, a minimum of at least 25,000 crores needed to be given to the ICDS. But if you look at Mr. Chidambaram's budget, we're giving it less than 18,000 crores. And we have added on a lot of more ambitious components to this program as part of its restructuring. So you are short of 8 to 9,000 crores. And what you've given in terms of additionality as against last year's program is barely going to be enough to cover competition. So we've not put enough resources into the program. Because you've not put enough resources into the program, program components have suffered. Weighing does not happen, supervision does not happen. 30% of positions of supervisors, people who are meant to supervise, if the Anganwadi worker is taking rates or not, have children being fed or not, 1/3 of the posts in the country are vacant. They're not being filled up by the state government. And for many state governments, they say there's no money available because government of India gives us less money than what is due. And even when the money comes in, when it is given out to the state government, it's low on the priority of spending. So finance will raise it at the last quarter. So many parts of the country I go to, I find that Anganwadi workers are not being paid for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, and so on. Now, under-resourcing is a problem that is inexcusable. I mean, the logic that we don't have money, at least for this government to say today, is completely inexcusable, not for an issue like this. And therefore, in my view at least, that if you ask me, when we did the calculations for the 11th plan, I was part of the steering group of the planning commission on food and nutrition. And at that time, the children's working group on the right to food, Mandana Prasad, Professor Jean Grez, others, Deepa Sinha, a set of very fine minds, nutritionists sat together. And they have estimated for the 11th plan that we would need at least 50,000 crores a year, close to 50,000 crores a year. The 12th plan is allocating less than 25,000 crores a year, or roughly about 25,000 crores a year. In real terms, it's going to be less. So we are already allocating less than half of what is needed. And on top of that, we are not releasing that money. We've allocated it in the plan, but we've not announced it in the budget. We're not making those funds available. So therefore, that is, in my view, something that it calls for some serious advocacy, some serious effort from all of us to look at the program, because other things will follow if the money is there. If not, money is a necessary condition, not sufficient. If the design is bad, you're not going to have an impact. But now, after a long time, government has put into a lot of thought into the ICDS restructuring plan. It's not a perfect plan. There are many gap areas. But at least in those 200 districts, we have a better chance of dealing with malnutrition than we had before. And yet they're not making those investments adequately. The third issue that I'd like to highlight a bit here is that there is a certain section within the intelligentsia, economists, nutritionists. Nutritionists are a divided community, so are economists on this. And there is a section which supports the view of one part of government. Thankfully, more or less, most people in government acknowledge that we do have a problem. But there is a certain section of economists and nutritionists who are still in denial. And if you read, for instance, the recent article that Arvind Panagia has been writing on why is it, saying that we're not really, what are these malnutrition figures about? There must be something wrong with them. Because obviously, India being the second fastest growing economy can't have these figures. And the logic that he gives, if you follow that logic, it's quite frightening because it's so obviously false. And yet, there is a certain section in government which is willing to buy that logic because it serves their ends to say that, look, the standards are faulty. The standards are faulty, that's why we are being shown in such a poor light. But actually, we're doing quite well. And if you look at the two main reasons that he gives, firstly, he says that, look, for countries in Africa which have a lower child malnutrition rate than India, like say Chad, they still have a higher infant mortality rate. Okay? So if Indian children were indeed malnourished and African children were doing better than Indian children, as the data tells us, then certainly more number of Indian children should be dying. Why are that in these countries which have a lower child malnutrition rate, is there a higher mortality of children? And the reason for that is very obvious, because in many of these countries, There's been the HIV/AIDS epidemic. You have incidence rates of 20%, 25% in some of these countries that Mr. Panambia is talking about. And therefore, and of course, you don't have health systems, you have war, you don't have any institutionalized mechanism like the ICDS and so on. So you don't have even a rudimentary health system that India does. And therefore, the chances of mortality if you are growing up there is much higher than if you were in India. The second issue that is raised is that surely WHO must have got it wrong. Because there must be a genetic, there must be something genetic about the entire thing. Indian kids can't be that stunted. Maybe different populations grow differently. Maybe if you took a bunch of kids from one country and compared them to a bunch of kids from another country, maybe they grew differently, and therefore it's not something that you should be worried about, because Indian kids are going to be like this. These standards are not really right. But for that, again, the answer is very simple. If you look at how the WHO growth standards were developed, India was a sample country, and they took the best conditions. So in India, for instance, I think the cohort, the children that were measured in India were from GK2 in South Delhi or some such place. What did WHO do? They just took a sample and they looked at children who grew to the fullest potential during a certain period of time without having any of these disabling factors. They had good access to healthcare, they were exclusively breastfed for 6 months, and so on and so forth. So that sample was selected, and India was a part of that cohort. So the data from that clearly shows that if all conditions remained equal, then Indian kids would follow the same growth trajectory. I mean, it wouldn't be exactly the same in that sense, but they would more or less, kids across would follow the same growth trajectory. And that is how the standards were developed. And therefore, these standards are actually lower than the previous standards on some parameters, because the previous standards, which are the NCHS standards, essentially took American children, some of whom were fed on formula milk, which is why WHO revised these statistics, because below the age of 6 months, it made a difference in the growth pattern. So therefore, but still there is a significant section, I would say, not in terms of numbers, but certainly in terms of influence. The Deputy Chairperson of the Planning Commission, Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, for instance, I heard him at a recent seminar, not saying it in so many words, but pretty much implying that, surely we're not doing all that badly. And if we had the data, then maybe, we are doing much better than we should have. But be that as it may, I think the fact that we are in fairly serious trouble is now acknowledged across the world. You also have programs like the school meal program in India. And if you compare the school meal program with the ICDS, you will find that the school meal program has typically done much better than the ICDS, because it has had more political currency, it has had better resources, it has been seen by politicians, by policy makers as a popular program and something that needs to be fostered. There is something about school meals globally that make them very popular programs. But even if our school meal program ran with 100% efficiency, which it is not at this point in time, it's certainly doing much better than most of our food programs. But even if it did, it won't have a very direct bearing on child malnutrition, because that part of the problem is already over by the time the child has gone to school. And it will certainly increase, as it has done in India's case, the enrollment of girls in schools. It will certainly increase learning levels, because your mid-morning hunger is taken care of, the children, if they're not hungry, learn better, and so on. But will it deal with that? So therefore, it's a very critical program, it's a very important program. But I'm not dwelling much on that, because it's not going to really deal with our issue of child malnutrition as we understand it. But it is a very, very critical program. Friends, we need to situate all of this somewhere, therefore, looking forward into a rights framework. And essentially the argument that people like me have been making, and the Right to Food campaign has been making, both in and out of the Supreme Court, on the streets, through our protests, and now through the attempt at legislation, is to say that for far too long, we have treated these programs merely as schemes. And as part of a larger social contract between government, elected and the electorate, that these are things government will do as part of a larger welfare framework. We are making an argument, or constructing an argument, that we need to shift that into a right. We need to shift that to make sure that it is no longer seen as something that is charity that the government does. but it is seen as the right and entitlement of the person who is the rights holder. It has been a different worldwide, and that will be able to be what is the fundamental right. We have the fundamental of food and nutrition stuff along with healthcare and education. Broadly, what we call economic, cultural, and social directive principles. When the constitution was framed, simply because the constitution makers had an argument that look, we are not in a position today to guarantee them as fundamental rights, and therefore there should be a progressive realization of these rights. But if you read the speech that Baba Saheb Ambedkar, father of the Indian Constitution, made on the floor of Parliament, he made a very impassioned plea for the state to actually take the directive principles as a cornerstone of state policy. Because they understood, our constitution makers were wise enough to understand that unless you have access to health, education, the whole gamut of BSc rights, you cannot enjoy complete freedom. But even so, over the last 30 years, even though the right to food is not explicated as a fundamental right in our constitution, courts have always interpreted it as part of Article 21, which is the right to life. Because the logic that the Supreme Court and High Courts over the years have given is that when the constitution makers spoke about the right to life, the right to life was not independent. It was not an animal existence. It was not something that was independent of the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to clothing. It was a right to life which meant a dignified life. A life that every human being, a basic life that every human being must enjoy with dignity, and these were part of it. The Supreme Court litigation over the last 13 years, and you can just look at the website of the Right to Food campaign, or our website or the PUCL website, and you will get the details of the case. I don't want to go into this because I think Kavita Srivastava, who's the head of PUCL, one of the National General Secretaries, she'll be coming here next week to address all of you. So she's going to talk about it in much more detail perhaps. So therefore I'm not going to that. But if you look at it, what the Supreme Court has really done is to expand these programs. In 2001, they gave two landmark orders. One on the universalization of ICDS, and second on the universalization of the midday meal program. And the court was very clear. At that time, I remember distinctly the Attorney General pleading with the court, saying we don't have the funds. And Justice Kirpal, who passed the order on universalization, he looked at him and he said, and I still recall his words, he said, Mr. Attorney General, please tighten your belt elsewhere. After 60 years, you cannot come and tell this bench that we don't have money to feed our children. So the first thing they did was they universalized these programs and recognized them as entitlements that all children in India must have. The second thing they did was they explicated the detail in much detail what this program should entail. So they left nothing to the imagination, in short. So if it was the midday meal scheme, they said you have to feed X number of calories, X number of proteins, X, Y, Z, and so on. If it was the ICDS, it was very clearly explained, it was very clearly explained. And third, they looked at implementation issues and passed some pretty landmark orders. One of the huge problems in the ICDS was corruption. And they continue, that of course continues even today, because the food that is supplied to these children through the ICDS is often contracted out at the state level. Karnataka, where we are sitting, is a bright example of where that happened. Where one private contractor essentially supplied cattle feed, what was equivalent to cattle feed, if media reports are to be believed, for years together, and nothing was happening till we took it up in the court, and now Lokayukta filed a case, and the officials were thrown out, the contracts were shut. I did a recent report for the Supreme Court where I showed how people like Ponti Chadha, the late Ponti Chadha, had a complete stranglehold on the contracts in UP. And I also showed through a very detailed investigation how in Maharashtra, the entire contract, because the court had said that look, you can't give it to private contractors, you have to give it to women's self-help groups at the village level to make this food and serve the children. And how in Maharashtra this entire thing was subverted by contractors getting their wives and daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law to form women's groups of what they call Mahila Sanstha, and grab how hundreds and thousands of crores of contracts. And that was happening across the country. So the court has dealt with all these issues. But democracy is not about the courts. It's not about the courts alone. And that is the reason why many of us have pushed for, worked on, and tried to put in place the National Food Security Bill, which is hopefully going to get enacted in this session, the budget session of Parliament. What has finally come through after years of negotiation is not a product that we are entirely happy about. But make no mistake, an act of this nature, which creates this right and guarantees these rights, and blocks the finances for enforcing this right, is a revolutionary step forward. We will be the first country to pass a detailed legislation on the right to food. Most countries which have done so, most notably in Latin America, and the pioneer amongst them was Brazil, have what we call framework legislation. But what India is going to do is go beyond framework law and create a very detailed law on entitlements. It falls short on many counts. There are many things that are wrong with the bill, but I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. So let me tell you what's right with the bill rather than what are the big gaps. What is right with the bill is the fact that it recognizes the right to food as a fundamental right, and it follows a life cycle approach, and it's been a huge struggle to, for instance, to get ICDS into the bill. It brings the ICDS into the ambit of the bill. It brings the midday meal program into the ambit of the bill. It brings the public distribution system into the ambit of the bill. And it is expanding the entitlement, particularly with regard to the public distribution system, to cover a larger section of the Indian population, though with a smaller quantity of food grains than what is ideal. What the bill is giving to most people is 25 kilos a month. For most households, what we would have liked is at least 35 kilos, if not 50 per household per month. And we would have also liked to have pulses in oil in it, like many states have, because the lack of dietary diversity, as you know, and the lack of quality proteins in our diet are a huge factor. The other thing that the bill does is it creates a maternity entitlement. Today you have a measly maternity entitlement of 500 rupees. That is being enhanced to 6,000 rupees. Every pregnant and nursing mother in the country would be entitled to 6,000 rupees. We have tried and struggled very hard to keep, these two-child norms and mothers below the age of 18 will not get it kind of thing out of this bill to create universal entitlement. I hope it comes through in its present shape. Even though the Standing Committee of Parliament had recommended that we should bring back the two-child norm, because of this great false sense of that we have untraveled population growth, and somehow if you bring in a coercive population policy, it's going to work, which is actually not part. Two-child norm that is not part of the national population policy. Even then, policymakers have this fondness for bringing it back, and we've been able to resist that. That is a big ticket change, the maternity entitlement and the recognition of maternity entitlement. One would have been happier if it was not an absolute amount but linked to minimum wage. Because when you recognize, what is a maternity entitlement? A maternity entitlement is after all recognition of a woman's role in childbearing, and it is a right. If a government employee or employee of the university can get 6 months off for at full pay, why should an unorganized sector worker not get that? So ideally we would have right to have linked it to wages and to say that look, ideally government should pay 9 months wages or 6 months wages as maternity entitlement, because that is the compensation that you're providing to her so that she can fulfill her childbearing responsibilities, and it's a right. And we could have said that no, we can't afford 9 months now, so we begin with, say, the 6,000 rupees really represents 1.5 months wages, and then we will increase it gradually as we have more resources. We would have been happier with that formulation. But even as it is, 6,000 rupees is not a bad deal. And the third thing I think is very positive is the fact that millets, as you know in India because of the green revolution, there has been lots of dietary diversity because millets which are nutritionally much better, and they're completely kicked off in many. They're making a comeback in elite households, but the poor didn't have access to them. Now the government is talking about bringing back millets as part of the GDS, which is again another positive thing. And lastly, there's a grievance redressal mechanism. It's not very effective in the bill. It's a bit of jobs for the boys, IAS officers and spouses and families. All of that gets lots of jobs because it very loosely defines who can become a member, who is to become a chairperson, and so on. And it's essentially for government employees to take on this grievance redressal role. Whereas we were very keen that this should have been done in terms of RBC says I'm doing well and I should speak for another 15 minutes, but I think I'll end in 5, is the fact that we could have had a more effective grievance redressal system, but we don't, but even then it's a good starting point. So I think this bill is very, very critical, and fingers crossed on how we go from here. So friends, I'll end here and I'll take on any questions that you have. It's open for discussion. Maybe I can take 4 or 5 questions and then.
Please ask your question and Viraj will answer them.
Mine very basic question. I've worked in one of the centers of ICDS in the district of Maharashtra. And when we were talking, the basic question was every year they get new workload. I mean, a much number of workload than the previous year. The estimated budget from every center is never passed. I mean, they do not get the estimated budget that they need for their work. Every year the workload is increased. So, I mean, when there's pending work left, I don't understand how efficiently it will work in the coming year. And the second question is, I do not understand the universalization of ICDS, because it will, I guess, more than equality, equity is much more needed in the country.
Yes.
I agree that the country has problems and but then the international comparisons are a bit troublesome. To take the example of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka couldn't count its total population between 1980 and 2000 something. Now, in a country we didn't have a clue about how many people were in the country, in the territory. How come it has precise statistics of a number of countries? And this similar argument applies to Afghanistan, etc. So, while or denying the problems here, I think the international comparisons need to be done much more carefully.
Thanks, Viraj. Nice talk. I had a couple of issues. One was to do with the ICDS. The ICDS sort of built on the TINUP, the Tamil Nadu project. And I thought that one of the big differences between the TINUP and the ICDS was the fact that TINUP was not a feeding program. It was actually a public health intervention to deal with malnutrition, and it was designed that way. So I'd like to hear your views on what has happened with ICDS in that sense. The second question I had is, you mentioned that in the 200 districts there were some design changes in the ICDS. So I'd like to get a sense of what actually has changed and why you think that's going to make a big difference to the outcomes.
2 more questions, then I'll do one round of answering, and if there's time, we'll do
Any states which, thank you, any states which have a higher provisions than the National Food Security Bill gives. So are you worried that when the National Food Security Bill comes out, in the time, I mean, it will take time for the results to show, but in that meantime, it might dilute the standards that these other states are currently employing, which are ahead of the bill.
Okay. Last question there, and then I'll answer.
It is like we are going for food security bill, and major focus is like on PDS scheme. We are going for millets and all this. It's a very good step, but in 5-year plans, we really struggle to make this PDS scheme only, like we go from PDS to streamlining it to focus group and such. So I also want to know your view, how it will be like universalization of all these schemes which were started much later on, and perhaps not focusing on target groups, will make this bill a success in future?
Last question.
Yes, I see this program in India. There are some states which done better. It has less equality. It's like Tamil Nadu, Kerala, some of the states have done better, then less equality. Then Gujarat also is done very bad because of the equality is more, and GDP is very high, the equality is also more. So that is the problem. So instead of you are concentrating on this one, how we can concentrate more on increasing the purchasing power of the rural people and the reducing inequality.
Let me just run through one round of answers, and then if you have time, we'll go to another set of questions. Now, on the question of universalism, of course, you have to understand universalization not as something that will create inequity, but will lessen. When we talk about universalization, or the principle of universalization, we are saying that everybody has a right. Now, everybody has a right does not mean that everybody will exercise that right, or will choose to exercise that right. Let me give you an example. Now, when you say you have the right to free speech, okay, you don't make a conditionality to it. You don't say that you have a right to free speech if you wear a yellow trouser, or if you don't put a conditionality. You don't say that you have a right to free speech if you come from this part of the country, or if you're rich or you're poor. It's a uniform thing. Similarly, our experience has been that in programs like PDS, ICDS, wherever there's universalism, it works better. Programs which are only meant for the very poor have tended to be very poor programs. Simply because if you look at the political economy of the village, if you have a PDS shop which is catering only to the Dalit private sector, it's virtually no, it was very little private sector. Education there still was, healthcare was virtually very little private sector. And let me tell you that we were not poor, but we had a ration card, we used to queue up, we used to get our kerosene and sugar or whatever it was. And when I was queuing up there was a university professor, very famous writer in my neighborhood, Vishim Sahni was there. There was also the rickshaw puller, there was also the person who worked in the house. And it was a great equalizer because the shopkeeper couldn't misbehave, couldn't open late or couldn't drive a service saying there was no stock because he knew there was hell to pay. The moment you remove people like us from it, the middle class or the elite from these systems, you end up with a very poor system. And that is the fun. And it's not that if the system was made open to everybody, everybody would use it or misuse it. If you look at Tamil Nadu, which has a universal public distribution system, for instance, you have a situation where almost 30% of the top quintile has opted out of the PDS. A large section of the top quintile, and if you do a quintile-wise assessment based on the NSO data, the richer you are more likely to opt out of the system. But you're still kept within it. If you wanted to, if your situation worsened tomorrow, then you would do it. Second is the cost of targeting. We have never been able to target our programs, as you very rightly pointed out. We are never able to target our programs. Look at the mess we made with the PDS with targeting. So you have a better chance of a program that works well. And please understand that many of these programs become self-targeting. NREG is universal entitlement. Rich or poor, anyone can go and work in an NREG website. I can leave this university now and go and work in an NREG website in my village if I want to. Because government has given me, created a right which gives me universal entitlement. But I won't do that because I don't have the ability to do manual labor. And I will not be, I don't think that, I think I can make more of my life than making mud for my livelihood. I don't have a problem with people who do that. I think it's great, manual labor is great. But I don't think that I will do that for the money that's offered. But if I were to fall on hard times, and if I had no choice, that's an option that's open to me. And many people have exercised that choice. When the recession happened, when the diamond polishing units in Surat closed down, all the labor from Ganjam and Orissa went back and worked on NREG work sites. So therefore, when you create universal entitlement, nobody, when the NREG was designed, would have been able to predict that that dealing with the recession, which the NREG is credited now with dealing with much better than India dealt with the recession, the global meltdown much better than most countries. And one of the factors that was credited, given credit, was one of course that our financial structures were more robust, financial systems were more robust insofar as banking was concerned. And the second was the fact that there was a continuous rural demand during the period of recession that allowed manufacturing jobs to be sustained. And this rural demand was created by the money and energy generated. So therefore, a universal entitlement does not mean inequitous entitlement. You have a greater chance of deepening equity. And in fact, the Supreme Court orders, when they universalized it, they were very clear, they were very explicit, and they said, you must start with saturating SC/ST hamlets. That first, all SC/ST hamlets must be covered with ICDS centers and urban slums, and then you go on. And we've written countless letters to states to monitor this. So I think there's no dilemma between universalization and deepening equity. Budget, yeah, I agree. I mean, if you don't, as I said, and that's the point I made, that if you don't make adequate provision for money, the kind of problems that you saw are very likely to happen, because you're increasing the workload, burdening the worker, adding on more services, but you don't have the money to deliver them. In Maharashtra, I think in most states, almost 25-30% of Anganwadi centers don't have skills, weighing skills. So how are you going to weigh these babies? And therefore, there's a big divergence between the data that comes out of the state government and data that comes out of the NHS. If you look at the state government data, it's always perfect. We have 5 to 7% managed. But if you look at Government of India data, then if you look at a third-party evaluation or independent data set, it's very different. And that's one of the problems. ICDS wasn't built on the TNIP came later, but ICDS, I mean the platform, what TNIP did right was, of course, have an additional worker, and therefore have the ability to focus, I think, more in an unconscious way on the other tools, which was not happening in other states. And insofar as feeding was concerned, because public feeding in Tamil Nadu is so central to Dravidian politics and to politics in general in Tamil Nadu, public feeding programs have a huge political stake there. Tamil Nadu had a separate noon meal program, and we had a noon meal manager, and they had converged and centralized all the noon meal packages, whether it was the MDM, the ICDS, onto one noon meal center. So that freed up a lot of time for time, energy, space, the ICDS center to really focus on issues that they should focus on. Now, insofar as the current design is concerned in the 200 districts, unless you put in additional workers, which in these 200 districts will happen, it is going to partly take care of this. But you're right, over-emphasis on feeding, particularly hot cooked meals, without providing adequate support in Anganwadi, is going to prove detrimental to the program. Hot cooked meals are a must, they must be given. But I don't have a problem if it is done in another location, not in Anganwadi. I really don't have a problem with the school meals and the ICDS meals and other meals, which are given in a village. But you have four or five feeding programs at the village level. If they can all be converged, and if government just puts in a little more money to converge it and do it the way Tamil Nadu does. I think Tamil Nadu has pioneered India, both in terms of not just ICDs but also midday, which were started in Tamil Nadu, in a sense. They were universalized in Tamil Nadu 20 years before the rest of the country. So I think that's a good lesson that we can learn. Now, in the 200 districts, again, the other thing that's happening is that you have to have a lot more focus on supervision, monitoring, and so on. You are creating additional incentives, additional structures, and you have financial incentives, and you have the money to it. Not entirely the way the ministry wanted, because they really wanted ICDS to be mission mode. Much in the same way, I mean, their logic was also impeccable that if education can have a mission, if health can have a mission, if you can have an NRHM and a Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, why should ICDS receive stepmotherly treatment? If health can have its own infrastructure, if education can have its own infrastructure, why should only 25% of Anganwadis be, or 30% of Anganwadis be of the department? Why can't the department have 100% of the infrastructure? So on these two demands, it's not completely conceded because of financial constraints. But in these 200 districts at least, there is a focus on creating your own infrastructure, clean drinking water, sanitation, kitchen facilities, increasing the supportive supervision role, having an additional worker, and having a mechanism right up to the district and higher level to monitor this. There also includes the IGMSY, the maternity entitlement. The first district that will be done will be these 200 districts. But I think I have much more hope than this restructured ICDs and much more hope on what the state governments are doing. And if you look at the states, there's a lot more happening at the state government level than there is happening at the government level. Particularly in states like Orissa and Madhya Pradesh, in Rajasthan, to some extent, even in Gujarat, Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh. Innovations galore across levels. Take severe acute malnutrition. Government of India has not even got its act together in the last 6 years that they have been talking about it in developing a protocol for treatment of children with severe acute malnutrition at the community level. You know, after a long delay, the facility-based guidelines came out. But state governments have gone ahead. They have created protocols, they have created the facilities. MP is going to be manufacturing therapeutic food locally for use within its, for the treatment of children with SAM and so on. So I'm more hopeful, and in fact, I would be even optimistic enough to say that if you did a NFHS 4 now, some of these states will see a much better result than you saw between NFHS 2 and NFHS 3. I mean, I'm quite optimistic because I do see, and also being personally involved in some of these programs, I do see a lot of change actually on the ground that's happening over the last 4 years. On the data, well, you know, by that, of course, there is a problem with Sri Lanka couldn't collect data in the north, in parts where there was a conflict. But that is true as much of India. I mean, the reliability of Indian data from Kashmir or from Nagaland, Manipur or Mizoram is about as good as the reliability of Sri Lankan data from those areas. Perhaps not as bad, but there are many parts of India also where our data is not accurate. But when you do these comparisons, in Sri Lanka, let me tell you my friend, of course, I completely agree with your point that there is a wide regional variation between North and South Sri Lanka. But Sri Lanka, if you look at the way they have developed over the last 50 years, I mean, there is very clear evidence, it's completely indisputable that they are doing better than most countries. Sri Lanka has been on par with many developed countries for the last 30 years of their social security papers. So, harbor no doubt on your mind about that. Now the data comparison, but maybe their malnutrition rate is 2% more than what they have collated, or maybe the infant mortality rate is slightly higher than what they have collated. But by and large, even if you go down there and look at the health system, you look at the education system, look at the literacy levels, we are. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And wherever data was not available, there's a plan. For instance, Afghanistan, we don't know, so there's a plan. We are not compared against those countries. Or whichever international agency collects these data, the data is not available, they keep the country off from the list of countries which are compared. So on that, I mean, we have to accept that things are pretty bad. Your question was a very interesting one, that what happens with the provisions being currently provided in some states are more than what the NFSB promises. Now, fortunately for us, in the constitutional scheme of things, food and nutrition are part of the concurrent list, which means that both state governments and central governments can share the responsibility. The National Food Security Bill is drawing the basic minimum that government of India will pay for. Anything over and above that, states are free to do, and they are doing it. States like Chhattisgarh, which have reformed their PDS, they're giving it at 1 rupee to the poorest of the poor and 2 rupees per kilo to the BPL families. They have expanded coverage to 95%. Just because the food security bill comes up and says that we are going to give only for 67%, doesn't mean the government of Chhattisgarh is going to roll back its program. In fact, what they're going to do is they're going to go and tell the electorate in the elections in 2014 that look, we gave you 90%, government of India is giving you 67%, and still we are bearing it from our own finances. And that is what the states are doing. Tamil Nadu is putting in 3,500, 4,000 crores extra every year to provide universal coverage and now free, sorry. It used to be 1 rupee earlier, now it's free. Okay, free food meals to every single person in Tamil Nadu who wants to claim that. Now they're spending 4,000 crores. Are they going to roll it back simply because central government brings in a central legislation? Because the central legislation is binding in so far as states cannot do less. I can go to court if my state government gives me less than what I'm getting now. But if I'm getting more, then certainly that doesn't rule, and we're better off than that. And of course, I agree with you. The the answer to everything is reducing inequality. And unfortunately, that is something that is not an Indian problem. Inequality is a problem that is global today. You look at the United States, you look at Europe, perhaps much worse than in India. In India, it is starker because the difference is maybe lesser, but it's very huge in terms of poverty and absolute poverty. It is much, much starker in India. But make no mistake, it doesn't mean that inequality is our problem or it's a South Asian problem. It's a global phenomenon, and I think it is going to be the single biggest issue over the next few decades because many countries are going to be blown apart, including India, if we continue on this path. And if you look at the map that I showed you of malnutrition, which I said corresponded very closely to the NSS data on say, poverty, you would find that it's exactly the belt where left-wing extremism is highest. And we have to ask as to why is there such a strong correlation between extreme poverty, malnutrition, and poor social indicator and the rise of left-wing extremism. And if we are not able to make that correlation between inequality and sustaining democracy, then we will pay for it. We won't be a democracy for very long. It's a very extreme statement, and perhaps an exaggeration. The Indian state is not going to give out without a fight, but it is going to continue to be a bloody affair that is today. And therefore, I think governments across the world are very cognizant about this. No more questions then? Yeah, sure.
But a lot of the malnutrition problem is also because of practices going wrong at the household level. Fresh cognitive feeling, hygiene, water, wellness and all that. But yet, when we talk about nutrition education, effective communication, home visits by ICDS, a lot of the things should happen in the household level. I didn't see much of that, in that. So is that also being taken care of? Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, it is. As part of the restructured ICDS, the IDC is a major thing. But I don't think that can really be taken care of. Good care practices at the household level can be taken care of, independent of the status of women's literacy. If you are not going to invest in women's education, and you expect that household care practices are going to be very significantly different because of television adverts, it's a mistake. And I think we have to wait much longer. Unless we see the more dramatic, and it is happening, fortunately for us. Increase in literacy rates in recent years is very encouraging. By the time the next generation of mothers, perhaps in the next few years, you will see the impact of the IDC more than you see it now. There are some programs today. There's a lot of money being invested by government on fostering better care practices and nutrition practices. But I doubt if their efficacy would be optimal given these factors. So, thank you.